Ethan Locke and Adrian Vance had been rivals for as long as anyone could remember. Their names were synonymous with power and ambition, their family empires towering over the corporate world like two monoliths forever locked in combat. Locke Enterprises and Vance Corp had dominated the tech industry for decades, each trying to outmaneuver the other in an unrelenting game of one-upmanship. And at the center of it all were Ethan and Adrian, two CEOs who wore their rivalry like a second skin. Ethan was sharp, calculating, and ruthless, a man who carried his family's legacy like armor. Adrian, on the other hand, was charismatic and visionary, his charm masking the same fierce determination that ran in his blood. Their public clashes were legendary, their boardroom battles intense enough to make headlines. Yet behind the spectacle, neither could remember the true reason for their mutual hatred. It wasn't until a chance discovery at an industry gala that everything began to shift. The gala was like any other. Glittering lights danced off crystal chandeliers, laughter mingled with the clinking of glasses, and the who's who of the corporate elite floated through the grand hall in a sea of tailored designer suits and evening gowns. Ethan stood near the bar, nursing a glass of bourbon and watching the spectacle with mild detachment. His sharp features softened in the dim glow, but his eyes carried the weight of someone who had long grown tired of the games these events demanded. Then his gaze caught on Adrian. The man was magnetic as ever, a beacon of confidence in a perfectly cut midnight blue suit that seemed to reflect the light just right. Adrian stood at the center of a small group of investors, flashing his easy smile, the kind that made people believe he cared. Ethan rolled his eyes and muttered something under his breath, already preparing to disappear to the quieter side of the room. But Adrian caught his eye, and with a smirk that practically dared him to look away, he sauntered over. "Locke," Adrian drawled, his tone dripping with mockery. "Enjoying the show?" Ethan took a slow sip of his bourbon and raised an unimpressed brow. "Theatrics were always your forte, Vance. Not surprised you're stealing the spotlight again." Their words were sharp, like blades that had been honed over years of practice, and yet there was an undercurrent of something unspoken, something that lingered in the air between them. Before their verbal sparring could escalate, an elderly man stepped into their orbit. His presence was understated, but oddly commanding, his weathered face marked by a lifetime of knowledge and secrets. "Ah, the Locke and Vance heirs," the man said, his voice a smooth blend of amusement and mystery. "It's almost poetic to see you two in the same room, without a courtroom or boardroom in sight." "Excuse me?" Adrian replied, his brow arching in surprise as he assessed the man. The stranger chuckled lightly. "Your families have been entangled in one of the fiercest rivalries this city has ever seen, feuding for over a century, I believe. Quite the legacy." Ethan exchanged a glance with Adrian, both of them equally baffled and annoyed by the intrusion. "And your point is?" Ethan asked, his tone sharper than he intended. The man didn't flinch. Instead, he leaned in slightly, his eyes gleaming with a mischievous twinkle. "Have either of you ever wondered why the feud began?" That question landed like a stone in still water, sending ripples through the tension between them. Adrian opened his mouth to respond, but stopped, his confidence faltering for just a moment. Ethan frowned, his mind racing. The feud was simply a fact of life, a truth they had both inherited without question. But now, with the man's question echoing in his mind, it felt as though a door had cracked open, revealing shadows of a story they'd never bothered to see. The old man gave a cryptic smile, as if he knew the secrets he held would haunt them. Then, with a tip of his glass, he melted back into the crowd. For the first time, Ethan and Adrian's banter faded, replaced by an uneasy silence. "Do you think he's serious?" Adrian finally asked, his voice quieter, his usual bravado dulled by a sliver of doubt. Ethan didn't respond right away. Instead, he stared into his glass, the golden liquid swirling as if it held answers. "I don't know," he said at last, his voice laced with something Adrian wasn't used to hearing: uncertainty. But before either of them could dwell on it further, the lights flickered. A murmur spread through the room, and a low hum of static crackled from the speakers. The elegant atmosphere shifted, replaced by a subtle, creeping unease. Adrian's smirk was gone, replaced by a cautious glance around the room. "What the hell is going on?" he muttered. Ethan set his glass down, his senses suddenly on high alert. Whatever the historian had meant, it seemed they were about to find out. Over the next few weeks, the question gnawed at them like a splinter lodged too deep to remove. Ethan found himself lying awake at night, replaying the cryptic words of the elderly historian. Adrian, on the other hand, threw himself into late-night research, his frustration mounting as every lead fizzled into a dead end. It was as if their families had gone to extraordinary lengths to erase the truth, leaving only fragments of a mystery too tangled to unravel alone. Their frustration came to a head one evening when Adrian, his tie loosened and his expression grim, ambushed Ethan outside a board meeting. The hallway was empty, save for the faint hum of fluorescent lights and the muffled voices of executives lingering in the conference room. "We need to talk," Adrian said, stepping into Ethan's path. Ethan, still holding a stack of reports, arched a brow. "What is it now, Vance? Another attempt to steal my clients?" Adrian rolled his eyes, but didn't rise to the bait. "I'm serious, Locke. About the feud. About why our families hate each other." Ethan's posture stiffened. He glanced around, ensuring they were alone. "What about it?" Adrian took a deep breath, his expression uncharacteristically earnest. "We're getting nowhere. Every lead is a dead end. Every document is either missing or redacted. If we want answers—" He hesitated, as if the next words physically hurt to say. "We'll have to work together." Ethan blinked, momentarily stunned. Then his expression darkened, his tone dripping with disbelief. "You're joking! Do I look like I'm joking?" Adrian shot back, his voice low but insistent. "I'm tired of this shadow looming over everything we do. If we want to know the truth, we'll have to dig together. No more games." Ethan studied him, his jaw tightening as he weighed the proposal. Trusting Adrian felt like dancing on the edge of a knife, but the historian's question haunted him too. Finally, he sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "Fine, but if you screw me over, Vance, I'll make sure you regret it." Adrian smirked faintly, though there was no humor in his eyes. "You'll have to get in line." From that moment, an uneasy alliance was born. They agreed to keep their investigation a secret, knowing full well that if their families, or worse, the media, caught wind of their cooperation, the fallout would be catastrophic. Publicly, they maintained the illusion of rivalry, trading barbs at press conferences and glaring at each other across crowded rooms. Their animosity became more performative than ever, but behind closed doors, they were a team. Their investigation was a labyrinth of half-truths and dead ends. By day, they wore their masks of corporate dominance. By night, they sifted through dusty archives, met with obscure historians, and interviewed surviving family members who seemed to know more than they let on. One night, they found themselves in a dimly lit study surrounded by piles of faded documents. The air smelled of old paper and ink, and the weight of history pressed heavily around them. "I don't get it," Ethan muttered, running a hand through his hair. "There's nothing here, just the same vague references to the betrayal and the incident. But no details, no dates, nothing." Adrian leaned back in his chair, his frustration evident. It's almost like they wanted this to be impossible to trace. Whoever covered this up didn't just hide the truth. They destroyed it. Ethan sighed, his gaze drifting to a family portrait hanging on the wall. The faces in the painting were eerily familiar, their sharp features and piercing eyes reminiscent of his and Adrian's. "What if—" he began, then trailed off, as if unsure whether to voice the thought. "What?" Adrian prompted, leaning forward. "What if this feud wasn't just about business? What if it was personal?" Ethan's voice was low, hesitant. Adrian frowned. You think this is about some ancient grudge between individuals? Maybe. Or maybe. Ethan hesitated again before meeting Adrian's gaze. Maybe it was about something or someone they were trying to protect. The suggestion hung in the air like a storm cloud, heavy with implications. Adrian's jaw tightened as his mind raced. If that's true, then we're not just fighting a feud. We're fighting to uncover something someone desperately wanted buried. As the realization sank in, a renewed determination sparked between them. They were no longer just rivals or reluctant allies. They were co-conspirators in a quest that felt bigger than themselves. But the deeper they dug, the more dangerous it became. One night, while poring over a particularly cryptic journal entry, Adrian's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, his face paling as he read the message. "What is it?" Ethan asked, his tone sharp. Adrian looked up, his expression grim. "I think someone knows what we're doing." Ethan's blood ran cold. "What makes you say that?" Adrian slid the phone across the table. The message was short but chilling. "Stop digging. Some secrets are meant to stay buried." For a moment, neither of them spoke, the gravity of the warning sinking in. Then, Adrian smirked faintly, though his eyes betrayed his unease. "Guess we're on the right track." Ethan wasn't so sure. As he stared at the ominous text, a knot of dread coiled in his stomach. Whatever they were uncovering, it was clear someone didn't want the truth to come out, and that someone was willing to do whatever it took to stop them. Their secret meetings became a strange, almost comforting routine. In dimly lit libraries, quiet cafes, and the occasional secluded corner of Adrian's penthouse, they worked side by side. The flickering glow of desk lamps and the soft murmur of pages turning became their soundtrack, a world away from the cutthroat rivalry they displayed in public. Each session brought them closer to uncovering the truth, but also closer to each other. The documents they found were maddeningly cryptic. Fragments of letters, torn journal pages, and ledger entries that hinted at a business deal gone catastrophically wrong decades ago. The threads were tangled, with dates that didn't match and names that seemed deliberately obscured. Yet they pressed on, determined to piece together the puzzle that had consumed their families for generations. As the weeks turned into months, their dynamic shifted in subtle but undeniable ways. Ethan began to notice the way Adrian's lips quirked up in triumph whenever he cracked a particularly challenging code. Adrian found himself drawn to the quiet intensity in Ethan's furrowed brow, the way his hand lingered just a second too long on the edge of a page, as if absorbing every word with painstaking care. Their banter, once a shield of sharp edges and biting remarks, softened into something warmer, something playful. "You know," Adrian quipped one evening as he leaned back in his chair, stretching his arms over his head, "this would be a lot easier if you weren't so insufferable." Ethan barely glanced up from the ledger he was poring over, a smirk tugging at the corners of his lips. "Takes one to know one," he shot back. Adrian laughed, a sound that seemed to fill the room with unexpected lightness. It was the kind of laugh Ethan realized he hadn't heard enough of, genuine, unguarded. For a moment, the weight of their family's feud lifted, leaving only the two of them and the strange connection they were beginning to forge. But their time together wasn't without its complications. The more they unraveled the mystery, the more they unraveled themselves. One night, as they sat in the corner of an old cafe, their table littered with papers and coffee cups, Adrian found his gaze lingering on Ethan longer than it should. Ethan caught him staring and raised an eyebrow. "What?" Ethan asked, his tone neutral but curious. Adrian shook his head, feigning nonchalance. "Nothing, just wondering how someone so frustratingly meticulous can still miss the obvious." Ethan rolled his eyes, but there was no real irritation in his expression. "And what obvious thing did I miss this time?" Adrian hesitated, his usual quick wit faltering. He could have mentioned the misplaced ledger they'd overlooked, or the clue hidden in plain sight, But instead, he blurted out, "You don't realize how much you've changed." Ethan blinked, caught off guard. "What are you talking about?" Adrian leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "When we started this, you barely tolerated being in the same room as me. Now, I don't know. It's like you've stopped pretending to hate me." Ethan didn't respond immediately. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, his gaze drifting to the window where rain streaked against the glass. "Maybe I have," he said quietly. The admission hung in the air between them, heavy with implications neither of them dared to explore further. Instead, they returned to their work, though the atmosphere was charged with an energy neither could ignore. As the nights grew later and the stakes higher, they found themselves sharing more than just research. They exchanged pieces of themselves, stories from their childhoods, half-joking confessions about the pressures of their families, and fleeting moments of vulnerability they hadn't shown anyone else. One particularly long evening, after hours of poring over an old journal, Ethan leaned back with a groan, rubbing his temples. "This is impossible," he muttered. "It's like they deliberately made it this complicated." Adrian smirked, leaning over the table to steal the coffee cup Ethan had abandoned. "Maybe they knew we'd eventually try to figure it out, a parting gift for the next generation of rivals." Ethan huffed a laugh, the sound surprising even himself. "I wouldn't put it past them." Adrian paused, his fingers idly tracing the rim of the coffee cup. "Do you ever think about what it would be like if things were different?" Ethan frowned, his brow furrowing. "Different how?" "I don't know." Adrian's voice was quieter now, almost hesitant. "If there wasn't this feud, if we weren't us." Ethan's gaze flicked to Adrian, his stomach tightening at the vulnerability in his rival's expression. "I think about it more than I should," he admitted, his voice low. Adrian looked up, startled by the honesty in Ethan's words. For a moment, they just stared at each other, the air between them charged with an unspoken question neither was brave enough to ask. Then, as if the moment had never happened, Adrian leaned back with a smirk, his walls snapping back into place. "Well," he said, his tone light but forced, "lucky for us, we're not quitters." Ethan gave a small smile, but his thoughts lingered on Adrian's words. The idea of a world where they weren't rivals, where they didn't have to hide behind barbs and banter, was as terrifying as it was tempting. As the hours stretched into the night, they returned to their research, but the shift between them was undeniable. The line they'd carefully drawn was blurring, and neither of them was sure what would happen when it disappeared entirely. But with their growing camaraderie came an unspoken tension, a magnetic pull neither of them could explain nor resist. What had started as an uneasy partnership, born out of necessity rather than choice, was evolving into something far more complex. Neither wanted to admit it, but the more time they spent together, the harder it became to ignore the way their presence seemed to charge the air around them. Ethan found himself lingering too long in Adrian's smile, the way it curved at the edges when he was genuinely amused. He noticed how Adrian's laughter had a way of filling the space around them, bright and infectious, as if it were meant to dissolve the barriers they'd spent years building. He hated how much he noticed it, and how much he didn't mind. For Adrian, the shift was even more unsettling. His thoughts drifted to Ethan during quiet moments, when he was staring out at the city from his penthouse window, or when he was lying awake at night, the world dark and silent. He started wondering what Ethan was doing, what he was thinking, if he ever felt this same inexplicable pull. It frustrated him to no end, but it also thrilled him in ways he wasn't ready to confront. Then, one evening, everything changed. They were working late in Adrian's study, papers and laptops scattered across the large oak desk. The room was dimly lit, the warm glow of a desk lamp casting shadows that danced along the walls. Ethan was reviewing a particularly dense document, his brow furrowed in concentration, while Adrian pretended to work, his gaze drawn repeatedly to Ethan's profile. The silence between them was comfortable, almost intimate, until Adrian broke it with a low chuckle. You always look so serious when you're working. It's a wonder you haven't scared off every client you've ever had. Ethan glanced up, one brow arching. And you always look like you're plotting something. It's a wonder anyone trusts you. Adrian smirked, leaning back in his chair. Touché. The banter felt easy, natural, but beneath it, the tension simmered. Neither of them acknowledged it, though it hung heavy in the air, threatening to snap at any moment. And then it did. Adrian stood, stretching his arms over his head. I need a drink, he muttered, walking toward the small bar in the corner of the room. You want anything? Bourbon, Ethan replied, his voice distracted as he flipped to the next page of the document in front of him. Adrian poured 2 glasses, his movements deliberate, as he considered the unspoken thoughts that had been swirling in his mind for weeks. When he returned to the desk, he set Ethan's glass down with a faint clink, then hesitated. Ethan, he said, his voice uncharacteristically serious. Ethan looked up, his expression wary. What? Adrian sat back down, his gaze unwavering. Why do you think this feels different? Ethan blinked, the question catching him off guard. What do you mean? You know what I mean, Adrian said quietly, his tone devoid of its usual sarcasm. This, us, working together. It's not just the feud anymore, it's... He hesitated, searching for the right words. It's something else. Ethan's chest tightened, a mix of apprehension and something else he couldn't name. Adrian, I don't think... But before he could finish, Adrian reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, worn envelope. He slid it across the desk toward Ethan, his expression unreadable. I found this last week. I wasn't sure whether to show you. Ethan frowned, picking up the envelope and pulling out the folded letter inside. As his eyes scanned the contents, his blood ran cold. The letter was dated over 50 years ago and was addressed to someone in Adrian's family. It spoke of a secret alliance, a forbidden romance between 2 members of their families. The writer hinted at their affair being discovered, at betrayal and consequences that would tear their families apart. It was the kind of revelation that could shatter everything they thought they knew about the feud. Ethan looked up, his heart pounding. This can't be real. Adrian's gaze was steady. It's real. I've cross-referenced the dates, the names. It all fits. But why wouldn't anyone talk about this? Ethan asked, his voice low, almost a whisper. Because it wasn't just about business, Adrian said, his voice soft but firm. It was personal, a love story that ended in disaster, and our families have been paying the price ever since. The weight of the revelation settled between them like a thundercloud, dark and oppressive. Ethan's thoughts raced as he tried to process what this meant, not just for their families, but for them. Adrian leaned forward, his gaze locked on Ethan's. You see now, don't you? This pull between us. It's not just random. It's not just tension or curiosity. It's history repeating itself. Ethan's breath hitched, his mind reeling. Was it possible? Could the strange, undeniable connection they felt be tied to a legacy they hadn't even known they were carrying? For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the faint ticking of the clock on the wall, a reminder that time was moving forward, even as they seemed frozen in place. Finally, Adrian broke the silence, his voice low and laced with something Ethan couldn't quite name. So, what do we do now? Ethan didn't have an answer. All he knew was that nothing between them, or their families, would ever be the same again. Ethan sat back in his chair, staring at the letter as if it might dissolve in his hands. The words blurred before his eyes, the weight of their implications pressing down on him like a physical force. Why show me this now? Ethan finally asked, his voice rough with a mix of anger and confusion. If you've had this for a week, why wait? Adrian hesitated, running a hand through his hair, a rare crack in his usual confidence, because I wasn't sure what it would change, and honestly, I didn't know if I wanted to open this Pandora's box. But after everything, he gestured vaguely to the stacks of documents surrounding them. You deserve to know, and we can't pretend it doesn't exist. Ethan's jaw tightened, his mind racing. A secret love affair. A betrayal buried so deep it became a foundation for the rivalry they had both inherited. It was almost poetic. Except now, it wasn't just a story from the past. It was a mirror of the unspoken tension that had been building between them. And that terrified him. This changes everything, Ethan said finally, his voice quieter now. He set the letter down but didn't look away from Adrian. If our families find out we're even talking about this, let alone working together, they'll tear us apart. They've already tried to keep us apart, Adrian said bitterly, leaning forward. And for what? So they can keep living in this never-ending cycle of hate and control? I'm done letting them dictate what I can and can't do. Ethan's eyes narrowed, a flicker of anger cutting through his uncertainty. It's easy for you to say that. You've always been the rebel, the one who does what he wants without caring about the consequences. But He hesitated, then shook his head. I can't just throw everything away. And you think I can? Adrian shot back, his voice rising. You think this doesn't scare the hell out of me too? But pretending it isn't there won't make it go away. The room fell into a tense silence, the weight of their argument hanging between them. Ethan looked away, his gaze drifting to the window where the city lights sparkled in the distance. He didn't know how to reconcile the storm of emotions swirling inside him, fear, anger, and something far more dangerous that he couldn't bring himself to name. Adrian let out a breath, his tone softer now. Look, I'm not saying we burn everything down tomorrow, but we can't ignore this. If we keep digging, maybe we'll find a way out of this mess. Together. Ethan's head snapped back to Adrian, his eyes narrowing. Together. The word hung in the air, heavy with meaning. And what happens when we cross a line we can't come back from? What happens when this, whatever this is, destroys us? Adrian didn't answer right away. Instead, he stood and crossed to the window, his silhouette outlined by the glow of the city below. Maybe it will, he admitted quietly, but maybe it's worth it. Ethan's chest tightened at the vulnerability in Adrian's voice. He wanted to argue, to push back, but the truth was, he didn't have an answer. All he knew was that the pull between them, this strange magnetic connection, was becoming impossible to ignore. After a long moment, Ethan stood, his movements slow and deliberate. He picked up the letter, folding it carefully and slipping it back into its envelope. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady but laced with determination. If we're doing this, we do it on my terms. No reckless moves, no unnecessary risks. Adrian turned, a faint smirk tugging at his lips, despite the tension in the room. Ethan Locke playing it safe. Shocking. Ethan shot him a glare, but there was no real heat behind it. Don't push me, Vance. Adrian chuckled softly, but the seriousness in his eyes remained. Deal, for now. They spent the next several hours mapping out their next steps, their focus shifting from their growing personal tension to the puzzle they were unraveling. They decided to dig deeper into the family's business records, looking for evidence of the betrayal hinted at in the letter. But as they worked, the unspoken tension between them lingered, growing thicker with every passing hour. Later that night, as Ethan was leaving Adrian's penthouse, Adrian stopped him at the door. Ethan. Ethan turned, his hand resting on the doorknob. What? Adrian hesitated, his expression unreadable. Then, with a faint shake of his head, he said, Nothing, just... Be careful. Ethan frowned, something in Adrian's tone setting him on edge, but he nodded. You too. As the door closed behind him, Adrian stood in the empty room, his thoughts racing. He hadn't told Ethan the whole truth. The letter wasn't the only thing he'd found. There was another piece of evidence, a photograph of two people, their faces blurred but unmistakably familiar. It had been tucked inside the envelope, and Adrian couldn't bring himself to show it to Ethan. Because if he had, Ethan would have seen the undeniable resemblance. To them. Adrian stood in the silence of his penthouse, staring at the photograph he had kept hidden. The dim light from the desk lamp cast shadows over the faces in the photo, but he didn't need perfect clarity to see what he already knew. The two people in the photograph, locked in an intimate embrace, their expressions a mix of love and anguish, looked eerily like him and Ethan. The resemblance wasn't exact, of course. The features were softer, the hairstyles different, but the essence was there. It was enough to make Adrian's chest tighten with unease. He ran his thumb along the edge of the photo, his thoughts racing. If Ethan knew about this, what would it do to him? They were already walking a tightrope, balancing their tentative alliance against the weight of their family's expectations. Revealing this photograph could tip them over the edge, and not in a direction Adrian was sure they could recover from. But keeping it a secret didn't sit well with him either. It felt like a betrayal, and the irony of that wasn't lost on him. Adrian sighed, slipping the photograph back into his desk drawer and locking it. Not tonight, he thought. Ethan, meanwhile, returned to his apartment, his mind still buzzing from the evening's revelations. He placed the envelope with the letter on his desk, staring at it as if it might reveal more secrets if he looked hard enough. The words haunted him, especially the final line, "This must stay between us, for the sake of everyone." The cryptic warning didn't just hint at betrayal, it screamed of something deeper, something dangerous. Ethan felt like he was standing on the edge of a cliff, the ground beneath him crumbling with every step closer to the truth. As he undressed and prepared for bed, Ethan's phone buzzed on his nightstand. He glanced at the screen, expecting a message from his assistant or a family member. Instead, it was from an unknown number. "You're getting too close. Walk away before it's too late." Ethan's blood ran cold. He stared at the message, his thumb hovering over the reply button. 100 questions flooded his mind. Who had sent this? How did they know about his and Adrian's investigation? And what exactly were they getting too close to? Instead of replying, Ethan screenshot the message and forwarded it to Adrian with a simple note. "We need to talk. First thing tomorrow." The next morning, Adrian and Ethan met at a secluded cafe, their usual spot for discussing their investigation without prying eyes. Adrian was already seated when Ethan arrived, his expression serious. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. "You got a warning, didn't you?" Adrian asked, sliding his coffee cup aside. Ethan froze, the words catching him off guard. "How do you know that?" "Because I got one too," Adrian admitted, pulling out his phone and showing Ethan a nearly identical message. "Whoever this is, they're watching both of us." Ethan sat down, his jaw tightening. "This isn't a coincidence. Someone knows exactly what we're looking for, and they don't want us to find it." Adrian leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Which means we're onto something big, something dangerous enough for them to want to scare us off." "Or worse," Ethan said grimly, his thoughts drifting to the possibility of what too close might mean. For a moment, they sat in tense silence, their eyes meeting across the table. There was no going back now, not after everything they'd uncovered, and especially not after the cryptic warnings. They both knew that stopping wasn't an option, even if it meant putting themselves at risk. "We need to figure out who's sending these messages," Adrian said finally. "And why?" Ethan nodded, his expression resolute. "Agreed. But we also need to be more careful. No more assumptions, no more risks. If we're being watched, we need to stay one step ahead." Adrian smirked faintly. "Careful planning? That doesn't sound like you, Locke." Ethan shot him a glare, but there was a flicker of amusement behind it. "Someone has to keep you in line, Vance." Their momentary banter did little to ease the tension, but it reminded them of what they had built. an unlikely partnership that was growing stronger despite the odds. That evening, as Adrian returned to his penthouse, he hesitated before unlocking his desk drawer. His fingers hovered over the key, the weight of the photograph pressing on his conscience. He knew he couldn't keep it hidden forever, but something about the timing felt off. Before he could decide, his phone buzzed again. Another message from the unknown number. "This is your last warning. If you don't stop, you'll regret it." Adrian's pulse quickened, and for the first time, he felt a genuine pang of fear. He stared at the message, then glanced toward the locked drawer. Whatever secrets the photograph held, they were clearly worth killing for. Without thinking, he picked up his phone and called Ethan. The line rang twice before Ethan answered, his voice sharp and alert. "What is it?" "We're not safe," Adrian said, his voice uncharacteristically shaken. "Whoever this is, they're not bluffing. We need to figure this out, fast." Ethan was silent for a moment before replying, his tone steady. "Then we keep digging, but we don't do it alone. If this is as big as it feels, we're going to need help." Adrian didn't argue. For once, he agreed. They were playing a dangerous game, and the stakes were higher than they'd ever imagined. The next day, Ethan and Adrian met again, this time in an abandoned office building Adrian owned on the outskirts of the city. It was a perfect location, secluded, untraceable, and far from prying eyes. Adrian had cleared out the room, leaving only a long table, 2 chairs, and a whiteboard where they'd started mapping out their findings. Ethan was already there when Adrian arrived, his expression tense. Spread out on the table were folders, printouts, and photographs they'd gathered over the last few months. Adrian noticed immediately that something was off. "You look like you didn't sleep," Adrian said as he dropped a cup of coffee in front of Ethan. Ethan ignored the remark, sliding a file across the table instead. "I went back to some of the old records we found at the library. There was something I missed before." Adrian picked up the file, his brows furrowing as he flipped through the pages. "What am I looking at?" "Read the names of the board members listed here," Ethan said, tapping on a highlighted section. Adrian scanned the list, his eyes narrowing. At first, the names seemed unremarkable, but then one stood out, a name he recognized from one of his own family's records. This one, Harold Vance. He wasn't just on the board of your family's company. He had shares in both companies. Ethan nodded grimly. Exactly. And not just shares. He had controlling stakes in several key projects. This guy wasn't just a businessman. He was playing both sides. Adrian sat back, the implications hitting him like a freight train. So the feud wasn't just about competition. It was about betrayal. But Harold Vance was my great-grandfather. Are you saying my family started this? No, Ethan said, shaking his head. It's not that simple. Harold wasn't acting alone. Look at the next document. Adrian flipped to the next page, his jaw tightening as he read. It was a letter dated shortly before the feud began. The signature at the bottom made his blood run cold. "Leonard Locke," Adrian muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "Your great-grandfather." Ethan nodded. It wasn't just Harold. Leonard was in on it too. They were partners, at least until something happened. That's what we're missing. Whatever broke their alliance, it was big enough to pit our families against each other for generations. Adrian let out a low whistle, leaning back in his chair. So what? We're just pawns in some century-old fallout between 2 greedy men? Looks that way, Ethan said, his tone bitter. And whatever it was, they went to great lengths to bury it. Adrian stood, pacing the room as he processed the revelation. This still doesn't explain the warnings. If Harold and Leonard are the key to all this, why would anyone care if we found out now? They're long dead. Ethan hesitated, his jaw tightening. That's what's bothering me too. Someone's trying to protect this secret, even now. Which means it's not just about the past. There's something in the present they're trying to hide. Before Adrian could respond, his phone buzzed on the table. Both men froze, their eyes locking for a brief moment before Adrian picked it up. Another message from the unknown number. "You're getting too close. This is your final warning." Adrian held the phone up for Ethan to see, his expression dark. "They're watching us." Ethan leaned forward, his voice low and urgent. "We need to figure out who's behind this, and fast. If they're this desperate to stop us, it means we're closer than we think." Adrian nodded, setting the phone down with a deliberate motion. "Agreed. But we need more than just the two of us. Someone who can dig deeper, find things we can't." Ethan frowned. "You have someone in mind?" Adrian smirked faintly, though his eyes remained serious. "I know a guy. He's unconventional. But if anyone can track down whoever's sending these messages, it's him." Later that evening, Adrian introduced Ethan to the guy in question, Max, a hacker with a reputation for finding the unfindable. They met in a dimly lit basement filled with computer monitors and wires snaking across the floor. Max was younger than Ethan expected, with sharp eyes that seemed to see through everything and a grin that bordered on cocky. "So, let me get this straight," Max said, spinning in his chair as he glanced between Ethan and Adrian. "You two corporate heirs are digging into a century-old family feud, and now someone's threatening you to stop?" "Pretty much," Adrian said dryly. Max leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "This is wild. I love it. Let me see the messages." Adrian handed over his phone, and Ethan followed suit. Max plugged them into his system, his fingers flying across the keyboard as lines of code filled the screens. "Give me a few minutes. If they're sloppy, I'll have something for you." As they waited, Ethan leaned against the wall, watching Max work. "You trust this guy?" he muttered to Adrian. "With my life," Adrian replied, his tone serious. "He's pulled me out of more than a few messes." Ethan was about to respond when Max let out a low whistle. "Well, well, well. This is interesting." "What did you find?" Adrian asked, stepping closer. Max turned his chair to face them, his grin widening. "The messages are being routed through a VPN to mask the origin, but there's a pattern in the encryption. It's old school, something you'd see from private corporate systems. My guess? These threats are coming from inside one of your families." Ethan's stomach dropped. "You're saying it's one of our own?" Max nodded. "Looks that way. And whoever it is, they've got resources. This encryption isn't amateur hour." Adrian's jaw tightened, his mind racing. "Can you trace it back to the sender?" Max smirked. "Already working on it, but it'll take time." Ethan exchanged a tense glance with Adrian. If someone from their own families was behind the warnings, it meant the betrayal wasn't just ancient history. It was still alive, festering in the shadows. And whoever was pulling the strings wasn't going to stop until Ethan and Adrian were silenced for good. Adrian and Ethan's investigation reached a fever pitch in the weeks that followed. With Max's help, they uncovered the truth hidden beneath decades of lies, misdirection, and buried history. Every revelation felt like peeling back a layer of an intricate, tragic story, one that neither of them had expected. The breakthrough came late one evening in the abandoned office building. Max called them in, his voice urgent, to show them a series of documents he'd decrypted from a private server. "These are old corporate records," Max explained, gesturing to the screens glowing with scanned letters and contracts. "But mixed in with them, I found something else. Personal correspondence between Harold Vance and Leonard Locke. Your great-grandfathers." Adrian and Ethan leaned in, their eyes scanning the words on the screen. The letters started amicably, proof that their families had once been close friends. They spoke of shared ventures, mutual respect, and even family dinners. But as the letters progressed, a name began to appear, James. "Who's James?" Ethan asked, his brow furrowing. Max clicked on another file. "James Locke, Leonard's elder brother and the great-granduncle of Ethan. And here's where it gets interesting. There's also mention of Nathaniel Vance, Harold's elder brother, and the great-granduncle of Adrian. Adrian's chest tightened as he read further. The letters took a sharp turn, their tone growing desperate and angry. James and Nathaniel, once the favored heirs of their respective families, were deeply involved with one another. Their bond, romantic and forbidden, had become a point of contention within their families. Leonard, James's younger brother, and Ethan's great-grandfather, accused Harold, Nathaniel's younger brother, and Adrian's great-grandfather of betrayal. Leonard claimed that Nathaniel's relationship with James had jeopardized both families' futures and legacies. Harold, in turn, fired back in his letters, accusing Leonard of failing to protect the families and allowing rumors and tension to spiral out of control. The feud reached its breaking point when James and Nathaniel tragically lost their lives under circumstances both families viewed as the other's fault. Each side blamed the other for the deaths of their elder sons and heirs, and the grief and bitterness that followed sparked a rivalry that endured for generations. The final letters were barely coherent, filled with rage and grief, both men blaming each other for a tragedy that wasn't immediately clear. Then Max pulled up the final piece, an old newspaper clipping. The headline read, "Tragic Deaths of Locke and Vance Heirs Stun City." Adrian's stomach dropped as he scanned the article. James and Nathaniel had been discovered dead, their bodies found in what was described as a violent altercation. The details were murky, but the deaths had shattered the families. Each blamed the other for the loss, and what had once been a bond of friendship turned into a bitter, unrelenting feud. Ethan's voice was hoarse. They were in love. Adrian nodded, his throat tight, and their families couldn't accept it. But there was something else, a detail that gnawed at the edges of Adrian's mind. He gestured to Max. "Pull up the correspondence from before the fallout. Look for anything that mentions an outsider." Max did as he was told, and after a few moments, he found it. A letter from Leonard to Harold, referencing a trusted advisor named Elias Gray. The tone of the letters shifted subtly after Elias entered the picture, his name appearing in conjunction with cryptic remarks about betrayal and doubt. "Who the hell is Elias Gray?" Adrian asked, his voice sharp. Max's fingers flew across the keyboard. A moment later, he pulled up an old photograph of a man standing beside Harold and Leonard, his features strikingly familiar. Elias Gray, Max said, was an associate of both families. But get this, he was also Nathaniel Vance's illegitimate half-brother. The room fell silent. Ethan's mind raced. "You're saying Elias manipulated both families? Why?" Max scrolled further, finding an old journal entry written by Leonard. The words leapt off the page. "Elias has planted a seed of doubt between us. I fear he covets something I cannot give, James's heart. If only Nathaniel would see the truth before it's too late." Adrian sat down heavily, the weight of the revelation sinking in. Elias was in love with James, and when James chose Nathaniel, he decided to destroy both families. Ethan ran a hand through his hair, his voice low and filled with disbelief. He planted evidence, fanned the flames of suspicion, and watched as everything fell apart. And when James and Nathaniel tried to escape it all, it cost them their lives. As the pieces clicked into place, something else stirred in both Ethan and Adrian, an unshakable sense of deja vu. Memories that didn't feel like memories flashed in their minds. Stolen moments in a sunlit garden, whispered promises beneath the stars, a desperate embrace before tragedy struck. It was as if they were remembering lives they hadn't lived, yet had. Ethan looked at Adrian, his voice trembling. "This is why we feel this pull. We're them." Adrian stared at him, stunned. "James and Nathaniel, they're us." The realization hung in the air, heavy and electric. Everything, every unspoken feeling, every inexplicable connection suddenly made sense. They were living the same story, drawn together by something greater than themselves. But this time, they had a chance to change the ending. The next day, they confronted their families, armed with the evidence Max had uncovered. At first, both families were resistant, unwilling to revisit the wounds of the past. But when Adrian and Ethan presented the letters, the photographs, and the truth about Elias Gray, the walls of denial began to crack. Ethan's father, pale and shaken, finally admitted what he'd always suspected. The feud was never about betrayal. It was about grief. We blamed each other because it was easier than facing the truth. Adrian's mother, her voice trembling, whispered, "They were in love, and we destroyed them." But Adrian and Ethan weren't satisfied with just the truth. They demanded to know why no one had tried to reconcile, why the lie had been allowed to fester for generations. That's when the final, devastating revelation came to light. Elias Gray hadn't acted alone. Before his death, he had passed on his bitterness to his own descendants, embedding the belief that the Locke and Vance families had wronged him. For generations, his heirs had worked in the shadows, ensuring the feud continued. When Adrian and Ethan left the meeting with their families, they felt lighter, but also more determined. They had uncovered the truth, broken the cycle, and freed themselves from the ghosts of the past. As they stood outside, the sun setting over the city, Adrian turned to Ethan, his expression softer than it had ever been. "So, Locke," he said, a faint smile playing at his lips. "What now?" Ethan looked at him, his chest tight but full of something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. "Now we decide how our story ends." Ethan and Adrian didn't wait long to test the waters of their newfound understanding. With the weight of the past clarified and the pull between them undeniable, they began seeing each other beyond their investigative meetings. It started innocently enough: quiet dinners in secluded restaurants, coffee dates in hidden corners of the city. But as their connection deepened, so did the desire to embrace what they had been dancing around for months. One evening, under the guise of a business trip, Adrian whisked Ethan away to a private lakeside cabin. The air was crisp, the stars brighter than either had seen in years, and the quiet allowed them to drop every pretense. They cooked dinner together, the warmth of the kitchen contrasting with the cool night outside. Ethan had been focused on chopping vegetables when he noticed Adrian watching him, a soft smile playing on his lips. "What?" Ethan asked, his tone laced with feigned annoyance. Adrian shrugged, leaning against the counter. "Just wondering how someone as uptight as you can look so comfortable." Ethan rolled his eyes, but couldn't stop the grin tugging at his lips. "And I'm wondering how someone as insufferable as you can have moments of sincerity." Adrian stepped closer, his voice dropping to a quieter tone. "Maybe you bring it out in me." Ethan froze, the playful air around them shifting. Adrian was close enough now that Ethan could feel the warmth radiating from him, could see the flicker of vulnerability in his eyes. "Adrian," Ethan began, his voice softer now, but Adrian didn't let him finish. "You don't have to say anything," he said, his lips quirking into a faint smirk. "But I think we both know what this is, what it's been." Ethan's heart pounded, his usual composure faltering, and for once he didn't try to fight it. Instead, he reached out, his hand brushing against Adrian's. The touch was tentative, almost shy, but it was enough to break the dam holding them back. In the glow of the kitchen lights, Adrian leaned in, his lips meeting Ethan's in a kiss that was both gentle and electric. It was the culmination of months of tension, of stolen glances and unspoken words. Time seemed to stop, the world narrowing down to just the two of them. When they finally pulled apart, Adrian rested his forehead against Ethan's, a soft laugh escaping his lips. "Well," he murmured, "that's one way to end a feud." Ethan chuckled, his voice lighter than it had been in months. "I'd say it's a pretty good start." The next morning, with their relationship no longer a question but a fact, they returned to their mission with renewed determination. With Max's help, they traced the remaining pieces of evidence to a descendant of Elias Gray, a man named Philip Gray, who had been orchestrating the feud's continuation from the shadows. Philip, as it turned out, was a board member in one of Adrian's companies, using his position to keep the rivalry alive and benefit financially from their family's perpetual distrust. Ethan and Adrian confronted Philip in his luxurious office, their presence imposing enough to make the man squirm. "You thought you could keep this going forever?" Adrian said, his voice cold as steel. "Using our families as pawns in your twisted game?" Philip smirked, though the nervous twitch in his jaw betrayed his confidence. "You wouldn't understand. My ancestor deserved better. He was cast aside, forgotten, while your families prospered." Ethan stepped forward, his tone sharp. "Your ancestor manipulated our families out of jealousy. He caused a tragedy that ruined lives and destroyed bonds, and you've spent generations continuing that legacy of hate. For what? Revenge? Money?" Philip's smirk faltered, and Adrian seized the moment. "We've uncovered everything. The letters, the photographs, the false evidence Elias planted. The feud ends here, and you, Philip, are going to confess." Philip's face drained of color. "You can't make me." Ethan cut him off. "No, but the evidence can. If you don't step forward, we'll expose you ourselves. And trust me, we're not afraid of the fallout." Faced with no escape, Philip relented, agreeing to a public confession. The next week, Adrian and Ethan held a joint press conference, the first time in decades that the Locke and Vance families appeared together. With Philip's confession and the evidence laid bare, they revealed the truth to the world. "This feud," Ethan said, his voice steady as he addressed the cameras, "has cost both of our families too much. It's time for it to end." Adrian nodded, his expression resolute. "We refuse to let the mistakes of the past dictate our future. Our families were once allies, and from this day forward, we intend to honor that bond again." The press conference ended with a handshake, a symbolic gesture of reconciliation. But as the cameras flashed, Ethan and Adrian shared a look that spoke volumes. They weren't just rebuilding their family's alliance, they were rewriting their own story. That night, after the press conference, they returned to the lakeside cabin, seeking solace away from the public eye. They sat on the porch, wrapped in blankets, as they watched the stars. "Do you think they'd be proud?" Ethan asked quietly, his gaze fixed on the sky. Adrian reached for his hand, lacing their fingers together. "I think they'd be happy we found each other, and that we didn't let history repeat itself." Ethan turned to Adrian, his expression soft. "I'm glad it's you, in this life and in whatever came before." Adrian smiled, leaning in to kiss him gently. "And I'll be glad it's you in whatever comes next." For the first time in what felt like lifetimes, the weight of the past was gone, replaced by the promise of a future they would build together, one filled with love, trust, and the freedom to write their own story.